The gears of Rome. The fog pressed against the grimy windows of Alaric Grayson's workshop like the breath of London itself, thick and yellow with coal smoke and the exhalations of 2 million souls. Inside, surrounded by the skeletal remains of a dozen timepieces, Alaric hunched over his workbench, adjusting the delicate springs of a grandfather clock whose owner would never return to claim it. The man had been found floating in the Thames 3 days prior, his pockets empty save for a ticket stub to the underground auction house on Drury Lane. Such were the hazards of collecting antiquities in Victorian London, where the line between scholarship and grave robbing blurred like watercolours in rain. Alaric had learned this lesson well over his 35 years, first as an apprentice clockmaker, then as a dealer in mechanical curiosities, and finally as something resembling a philosopher, though he would never claim such a lofty title. He preferred to think of himself as a student of time itself, fascinated by humanity's eternal struggle to measure, contain, and ultimately master the one force that mastered them all. The brass pendulum caught the gaslight as it swung, casting hypnotic shadows across the cluttered workshop. Gears of every size and description littered the shelves, some pristine and new from the Birmingham manufactories, others green with age and mystery. It was among these ancient mechanisms that Alaric felt most at home, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries spent trying to mark time's passage. A sharp rap at the door interrupted his meditations. The sound came again, more insistent, followed by a voice rough with tobacco and years. "Grayson!" "Open up, you hermit. I've got something that'll interest you." Alaric recognised the voice of Fletcher Moss, one of London's more reputable antiquities dealers, which was to say he only occasionally dealt in stolen goods. The clockmaker wiped his hands on a rag and opened the door to reveal a wiry man with silver whiskers and eyes bright with avarice. "What brings you out in this fog, Fletcher?" "Surely not the pleasure of my company." "Business, my friend. Always business." Fletcher stepped inside, shaking droplets from his coat. "There's an auction tonight. Private affair. The sort where they don't ask too many questions about provenance, if you take my meaning." Alaric did take his meaning. Such auctions were where the most interesting pieces surfaced, objects with histories too complex or controversial for the legitimate houses. "What manner of items?" "Roman pieces mostly, some Greek. There's one lot in particular." Fletcher's eyes gleamed. "A sundial, ancient, covered in gears like nothing I've seen before. The seller claims it's cursed." "Cursed how?" "3 previous owners, all vanished without trace. The last was that gentleman who ended up in the Thames." Fletcher grinned, showing teeth stained brown with tobacco. Naturally, this has depressed the expected price somewhat. Alaric felt his pulse quicken. He had been searching for months for an authentic Roman timepiece, something that might illuminate the sophisticated understanding of mechanics possessed by the ancients. The famous Antikythera mechanism had proven that classical civilizations were far more advanced than modern scholars believed, but examples were vanishingly rare. "Show me," he said simply. The auction house occupied the basement of a building that had once been a monastery, its stone walls perfect for muffling the sounds of questionable commerce. Gas flames flickered in wrought-iron sconces, casting dancing shadows over the assembled crowd of collectors, dealers, and curiosity seekers. The air was thick with pipe smoke and whispered speculation. Alaric found himself drawn to lot 23, displayed on a wooden table beneath a glass dome. The sundial was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Bronze and brass components were integrated into what appeared to be marble base, carved with Latin inscriptions he could partially read: "Tempus fuit, tempus manet," "Time flees, time remains." But there were other symbols too, geometric patterns and astronomical diagrams that seemed to shift in the flickering gaslight. The gearwork was extraordinary. Tiny bronze wheels and escapements were visible through gaps in the marble housing, suggesting a mechanism of incredible complexity. This was no simple timepiece, but something approaching a mechanical computer, designed to track the movements of celestial bodies with precision that wouldn't be matched until the Renaissance. "Lot 23, called the auctioneer, a thin man with the pallor of someone who conducted business exclusively in basements. "Roman sundial, provenance uncertain, condition as seen. Bidding starts at £5. The crowd was smaller than usual, and their enthusiasm notably subdued. Superstition ran deep among antiquities dealers, and the sundial's reputation preceded it. Alaric found himself bidding against only 2 other collectors, and within minutes had secured the piece for the surprisingly modest sum of £18. As he arranged for delivery, Fletcher appeared at his elbow. "You've got stones, I'll give you that. Most wouldn't touch that thing for twice the price." "Superstition is the enemy of knowledge," Alaric replied, though he couldn't entirely suppress a shiver as he looked at his purchase. There was something about the device that seemed to watch him back, as if the geometric patterns carved into its surface were eyes rather than mere decoration. The sundial arrived at his workshop the following evening, delivered by 2 men who seemed eager to complete their business and depart. Alaric spent the next several days examining it under magnification, marvelling at the precision of its construction. The gears were cut with mathematical exactness, and the astronomical calculations encoded in its structure revealed an understanding of celestial mechanics that shouldn't have existed for another 1,000 years. But it was the inscriptions that truly captured his imagination. Alongside the Latin were symbols he couldn't identify, resembling no alphabet he knew. Some appeared to be numerical, others geometric, but their meaning remained tantalizingly out of reach. He consulted every reference book in his extensive library, wrote letters to scholars at Oxford and Cambridge, even visited the British Museum to examine their collection of Roman artefacts. Nothing matched the mysterious symbols on his sundial. As December progressed and the winter solstice approached, Alaric became increasingly obsessed with the device. He worked late into the night, oil lamps burning low as he traced the intricate gear patterns and attempted to decode the cryptic inscriptions. Sleep became elusive, haunted by dreams of bronze wheels turning in darkness and voices speaking in tongues he almost but not quite understood. It was on the night before the solstice that inspiration struck. Alaric had been studying the sundial's shadow-casting gnomon when he noticed something peculiar about its angle. Rather than being fixed in the traditional manner, it appeared to be adjustable, connected to the internal mechanism by a series of nearly invisible gear teeth. Moreover, the marble base contained what looked like mounting points for additional components, mirrors perhaps, or prisms. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't simply a sundial, but something far more complex, a machine designed to manipulate light itself. The gears weren't merely tracking the sun's position, but calculating something else entirely, something that required artificial illumination to function properly. Working with feverish intensity, Alaric began constructing a support apparatus from parts in his workshop. He mounted mirrors on adjustable arms, positioned prisms to split and redirect light, and connected the entire assembly to a gear table powered by a combination of steam pressure and magnetic force. The theory was audacious. If he could recreate the conditions of natural sunlight at the precise moment of solstice, the sundial might reveal its true purpose. The work consumed him completely. He forgot to eat, sleeping only when exhaustion forced him to collapse over his workbench. His landlady, Mrs. Pemberton, knocked repeatedly at his door, concerned by the strange sounds and smells emanating from the workshop. Alaric barely heard her. All his attention was focused on the approaching solstice and the culmination of his experiment. December 21st arrived grey and cold, with snow beginning to fall as evening approached. Alaric made his final preparations as midnight drew near, adjusting mirrors and checking gear ratios with obsessive precision. The sundial sat at the centre of his elaborate apparatus, its bronze surfaces gleaming in the lamplight, waiting. At 5 minutes to midnight he ignited the gas jets that would power his artificial sun. Light blazed forth, reflected and refracted through the network of mirrors and prisms, casting geometric shadows that danced across the sundial's surface like living things. The internal gears began to turn, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as the device found its rhythm. The sound was unlike anything Alaric had ever heard. Not the familiar tick-tock of clockwork, but something deeper, a harmonic resonance that seemed to penetrate his very bones. The shadows cast by the sundial's gnomon began to move independently of the light source, tracing patterns that hurt to look at directly. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that made his hair stand on end. As the church bells of London began to toll midnight, marking the exact moment of winter solstice, the sundial reached a crescendo of activity. Gears spun with impossible speed, shadows writhed like serpents, and the harmonic resonance grew so intense that the windows of the workshop began to crack. Alaric reached out to shut down the apparatus, suddenly afraid of what he had unleashed, but it was too late. The world folded in on itself. There was no explosion, no flash of light or crash of thunder. Instead, silence descended like a curtain, followed by pressure that seemed to compress his very soul. Gravity became a living thing, crushing him down and then releasing him so suddenly that he felt himself falling upward into darkness. Time stretched like taffy, each second containing eternities, until consciousness finally fled and left him drifting in a void between moments. Alaric awoke to the sound of birds singing and the warmth of sunlight on his face. The sensations were so pleasant, so completely at odds with the London winter he remembered, that for a moment he simply lay still and enjoyed them. Then reality intruded, and he opened his eyes to find himself lying in a grove of olive trees under a sky so blue it seemed painted. He sat up slowly, his head spinning with disorientation. The air was warm and dry, scented with herbs he couldn't name, and completely free of the coal smoke that was London's constant companion. In the distance he could see white buildings climbing the slopes of hills, their architecture familiar from countless classical illustrations but impossible to mistake for anything modern. The remnants of his sundial lay scattered around him, broken into pieces but recognisably the same device he had been experimenting with hours, or was it centuries, before. His pocket watch, miraculously undamaged, read 2:30, though whether that was afternoon or morning remained unclear. Most disturbing of all, his Victorian clothing, while rumpled and torn, showed no signs of the violent displacement he remembered. A sound of hoofbeats and jingling harness interrupted his examination of the situation. Through the olive trees came a column of men on horseback, their bronze armour gleaming in the sunlight, red cloaks streaming behind them. Roman soldiers, as authentic as the illustrations in his history books, but possessing a vitality and presence that no artist could capture. Alaric's first instinct was to hide, but he was too slow. The lead rider spotted him immediately and barked an order in Latin. The column wheeled toward him with military precision, surrounding him before he could even stand. The decurion who commanded them was a weathered man with scars on his arms and the calculating eyes of a professional soldier. He spoke in rapid Latin, of which Alaric caught perhaps one word in 3. The tone, however, was unmistakable. He was being questioned, and his answers would determine his immediate future. "Non intelligo," Alaric managed, hoping his pronunciation wasn't too atrocious. "I don't understand." The decurion's expression grew suspicious. He dismounted and approached, studying Alaric's clothing with obvious puzzlement. The cut and fabric of Victorian garments were unlike anything from the classical world, and Alaric's pale complexion and soft hands marked him clearly as no labourer or soldier. More Latin followed, accompanied by gestures that needed no translation. Alaric was being taken prisoner, his stammered protests in broken Latin only convincing his captors that he was either a spy or touched by the gods. Either way, he represented something to be investigated by higher authorities. The journey to Rome took 3 days, during which time Alaric learned the realities of ancient travel. The roads, while impressively straight and well-maintained, were hard on feet accustomed to London's cobblestones. The soldiers shared their rations grudgingly, and water was precious enough that his request for a wash was met with laughter. But it was the city itself that truly drove home the reality of his situation. Rome in the reign of Domitian was not the picturesque ruin of later centuries, but a living metropolis of 1,000,000 souls, its streets crowded with merchants, slaves, citizens and foreigners from every corner of the known world. The smell was overwhelming: unwashed bodies, cooking food, animal waste and the smoke of countless fires all combined into an assault on senses accustomed to Victorian standards of hygiene. The slave market where Alaric found himself was a revelation in casual brutality. Men and women were examined like livestock, their teeth checked, muscles tested, scars catalogued by buyers with the detached professionalism of horse traders. Alaric's unusual appearance and obvious education saved him from the worst fate: hard labour in the mines or quarries, but his destination was still servitude. Lucius Varro proved to be a senator of middle rank, wealthy enough to maintain a substantial household, but not so elevated as to attract dangerous attention from the emperor. He was a man in his 50s with the soft physique of comfortable living, and the calculating gaze of someone who had survived decades of Roman politics. His examination of Alaric was thorough and uncomfortably intelligent. "You're no Gaul or German," he said in accented but perfectly understandable Greek, evidently having concluded that Alaric might be from the eastern provinces. "Your hands are too soft for manual labour, but you lack the bearing of nobility. A scribe, perhaps? A tutor?" Alaric nodded eagerly, seizing on the suggestion. "Yes, Dominus. I have knowledge of mechanical things, mathematics, astronomy." Varro's eyebrows rose slightly. Such skills were valuable in a world where accurate calendars and water clocks were marks of sophistication. "Show me." The senator led him to a courtyard where a water clock had stopped functioning, its bronze mechanisms seized with corrosion and neglect. Alaric examined it with the eye of a professional, identifying the problems and the tools that would be needed to correct them. Within an hour, he had the device functioning again, its steady drip marking time with mechanical precision. "Interesting," Varro murmured. "Very interesting indeed." Life in the senator's household followed patterns established over centuries. Alaric was given quarters with the other educated slaves, men who served as secretaries, tutors, and accountants. His status was ambiguous, clearly valuable but equally clearly not to be trusted with sensitive information. He was fed well, clothed adequately, and expected to maintain and repair the various mechanical devices that were marks of Roman sophistication. But it was in the evenings, when his duties were complete, that Alaric began to uncover the mystery that had brought him to this time and place. The senator's library was extensive, containing works on natural philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy that wouldn't survive the fall of Rome. More importantly, it contained references to something called the Collegium Mechanicus, the Mechanist Guild. The references were fragmentary and often cryptic, but they painted a picture of an organisation that had existed in the shadows of Roman society for generations. They were engineers and inventors, students of what they called ars temporalis, the art of time. According to the texts, they believed that time itself was not an abstract concept, but a physical force that could be manipulated through mechanical means. The idea was not entirely foreign to Alaric. His own experiments with chronometry had led him to similar conclusions, though he had lacked the theoretical framework to pursue them systematically. The Romans, it seemed, had been less constrained by the boundaries between science and metaphysics. His breakthrough came while translating a damaged papyrus that Varro had acquired from Alexandria. The text described something called a temporal anchor, a device that could detect and exploit what the author termed fractures in the flow of time. The description matched his sundial so precisely that Alaric felt his hands shake as he read. According to the papyrus, these fractures occurred naturally at certain times and places where the celestial mechanics created conditions of temporal instability. The winter solstice was one such time, particularly when combined with specific astronomical alignments that occurred only rarely. A temporal anchor could detect these fractures and, with proper preparation, allow a person to move from one time to another. The implications were staggering. Alaric had not been the victim of some inexplicable accident, but the beneficiary, or victim, of a technology that the Romans had understood far better than he had initially realised. His sundial was not merely an ancient artifact, but a working piece of equipment designed for the specific purpose of time travel. But the papyrus also contained warnings. The process was dangerous, requiring precise calculations and perfect timing. More ominously, it mentioned the Custodes Temporis, the Guardians of Time, a group that viewed such experimentation as blasphemy against the natural order. They were described as fanatics who would stop at nothing to prevent the misuse of temporal technology. As autumn turned to winter in his second year of captivity, Alaric began to make discreet inquiries about the Mechanist Guild. His position in Varro's household gave him access to other scholars and antiquarians, men who collected rumours along with manuscripts. Slowly, a picture emerged of an organisation that still existed, hidden in the depths of Rome's underground, continuing research that had begun centuries earlier. The breakthrough came through Marcus Cassia, a young woman who served as a scribe in the Temple of Minerva. Alaric encountered her while researching astronomical texts for Senator Varro, and their shared interest in ancient mathematics quickly developed into something deeper. Cassia was unusual for a Roman woman, educated beyond the normal limits, and possessed of a fierce intelligence that reminded Alaric of the suffragettes he had known in London. It was Cassia who first mentioned the Vault of Kronos, almost as an aside while discussing Alexandrian astronomy. According to legend, it was an underground temple near Delphi where the most sacred mysteries of time were preserved. The Mechanist Guild supposedly maintained it as their ultimate repository, the place where their most dangerous experiments were conducted and their most precious artifacts preserved. Of course, no one believes such stories anymore, she said, with a smile that suggested she might believe them herself. The age of mysteries is past. We are rational people now, governed by law and logic. But Alaric had seen too much to dismiss any possibility. That night, examining the broken pieces of his sundial by lamplight, he noticed something he had missed before. The fracture patterns weren't random, but followed the geometric designs carved into the marble base. It was as if the device had been designed to break in a specific way, creating puzzle pieces that could be reassembled if one understood the underlying pattern. Working through the long Roman nights, Alaric began to reconstruct his temporal anchor. The work was painstaking, requiring tools and materials that were difficult to obtain without arousing suspicion. Bronze and brass could be acquired from metalworkers, but the precise gears required handcrafting to tolerances that strained the limits of Roman technology. It was during this period that he noticed he was being watched. Senator Varro had always been observant, but now his attention seemed focused and predatory. Conversations that had once been casual became interrogations, and Alaric's movements around the household were increasingly monitored. The confrontation came on a winter evening when Alaric was working late in the senator's library. Varro entered silently, his footsteps muffled by expensive carpets, and stood watching for several minutes before speaking. "You're not what you pretend to be," the senator said quietly. "I've known this for months, but I've been patient, waiting to understand what you truly represent." Alaric's hand moved instinctively toward the concealed components of his sundial, but Varro was faster. Roman politics bred quick reflexes, and the senator had a dagger at Alaric's throat before he could react. "I know about the guild," Varro continued conversationally. "I know about their obsession with time and their belief that the past can be changed to serve the present. What I don't know is whether you're one of their agents or something else entirely." The blade was sharp enough that Alaric could feel it parting the skin of his neck. Any movement would open his throat, but lying still meant accepting whatever fate the senator had planned for him. "I'm not their agent," he said carefully. "I'm something they never anticipated. I'm from the future, Senator, from a time 1700 years beyond this moment." Varro's laugh was genuinely amused. "An interesting claim. Can you prove it?" Alaric reached slowly into his toga, moving with deliberate care to avoid startling the armed man. He withdrew his pocket watch, its Victorian craftsmanship immediately apparent to anyone with knowledge of mechanical devices. The precision of its gears, the quality of its springs, the sophistication of its escapement, all were centuries beyond anything the Romans could produce. The senator examined the watch with growing amazement, his political instincts warring with the evidence of his senses. The craftsmanship was undeniable, but the implications were staggering. "If this is true," he said finally, "then you represent an opportunity beyond anything I dared imagine. The knowledge you possess, the technologies of your time, they could transform Rome, make us truly eternal." It was then that Alaric understood the true danger of his situation. Varro didn't want to expose him or turn him over to authorities. The senator wanted to use him, to extract the secrets of the future and apply them to his own advancement. In the ruthless calculus of Roman politics, Alaric had become the ultimate resource. "I can't give you what you want," Alaric said. "The principles that govern such technologies require centuries of development, foundations that don't exist in your time. Then we'll have to settle for what you can provide." The dagger hadn't moved from his throat. "Your knowledge of coming events, for instance. Wars, succession crises, natural disasters. Such information would be invaluable to someone with the wisdom to use it properly." The conversation was interrupted by shouting from the courtyard, followed by the clash of steel on steel. Varro cursed and moved toward the window, momentarily distracted. Alaric seized the opportunity, grabbing the senator's wrist and twisting until the dagger fell. The two men struggled briefly, but Alaric's desperation gave him an advantage that Varro's superior training couldn't overcome. The senator went down hard, his head striking the marble floor with a sound like breaking pottery. Blood pooled beneath his skull, and his breathing became laboured and irregular. Alaric checked for a pulse, found it weak and erratic, and realised that Lucius Varro would not survive the night. The sounds of fighting were growing closer, accompanied by shouting in a dialect Alaric didn't recognise. Through the window he could see torches moving through the senator's gardens, carried by figures in dark robes. The custodes temporis had found him. Grabbing the components of his sundial and what tools he could carry, Alaric fled through the library's rear entrance into the maze of corridors that honeycombed the senator's house. Behind him he could hear doors splintering and voices raised in religious fervour. The Guardians of Time had come to cleanse the world of temporal blasphemy, and they would not be deterred by anything as mundane as Roman law. The escape route led through the household slave quarters, where terrified servants cowered in their cells as armed fanatics swept through the building. Alaric's unusual status gave him knowledge of the house's layout that proved invaluable. He knew which passages led to dead ends and which connected to the city's underground drainage system. Rome's sewers were an engineering marvel, but they were also a refuge for those who couldn't afford to live above ground. Alaric found himself in a world beneath the world, where escaped slaves, deserters, and criminals had created a shadow society that mirrored the one above. Here, in the stinking darkness beneath the eternal city, he encountered others who had reason to fear the Guardians of Time. They called themselves the remnants of the Mechanist Guild, though their numbers were few and their resources limited. Their leader was a man named Gaius Mechanicus, almost certainly not his birth name, who had spent decades studying the temporal sciences in hiding. He was ancient by Roman standards, perhaps 70 years old, but his mind remained sharp and his dedication absolute. "We have waited for someone like you," he told Alaric during their first meeting in a chamber carved from the living rock beneath the Palatine Hill. The prophecies spoke of a walker between times who would come from the future to complete the great work. Alaric was sceptical of prophecies, but he couldn't deny the accuracy of their descriptions. The texts the guild had preserved matched his experience too closely to be coincidental. They spoke of a man who would arrive with knowledge of sciences yet to be born, bearing a temporal anchor that could unlock the deepest mysteries of time itself. "What is this great work you speak of?" he asked. Gaius smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had waited decades to answer that question. The mastery of time itself, the ability to move freely through the centuries, to correct the errors of the past and shape the future according to wisdom rather than chance. It was an intoxicating vision, but Alaric had learned to be suspicious of grand ambitions. And the cost? There's always a cost to such power. "The cost is what we're paying now," Gaius replied. "Hiding in sewers, hunted by fanatics, watching Rome decline while we possess the knowledge to save it. The Guardians of Time believe that temporal manipulation is blasphemy, but they're wrong. Time is a tool, like fire or the wheel. It can be used for good or ill, but it cannot be ignored." Over the following weeks, Alaric learned the full scope of the guild's research. They had been studying temporal mechanics for generations, building on fragments of knowledge that suggested an even older tradition. The techniques they had developed were crude compared to what Alaric remembered from his own experiments, but they were based on sound principles and had yielded genuine results. The Vault of Kronos was real, they assured him, though reaching it would be extraordinarily dangerous. It lay beneath a temple complex near Delphi, in chambers that had been carved from the bedrock before the Greeks arrived. The guild maintained it as their ultimate repository, but access required passing through defences both technological and mystical. "The ancients who built it understood truths that we're only beginning to rediscover," Gaius explained. "They knew that time is not uniform. It flows differently in different places, pools in some locations and rushes like a torrent in others. The vault sits at the centre of such a pool, a place where past, present and future intersect. Preparations for the journey took months. The guild's resources were limited, and everything had to be done in secrecy to avoid attracting the attention of the Guardians. Maps had to be studied, supplies gathered, and routes planned that would avoid both Roman patrols and the fanatics who hunted them. It was during this period that Alaric's relationship with Cassia deepened into something approaching love. She had joined him in the underground, abandoning her position at the temple to help with his research. Her knowledge of ancient languages proved invaluable in deciphering the texts that would guide their journey, and her presence provided an anchor of humanity in the increasingly abstract world of temporal mechanics. "Are you certain this is what you want?" he asked her one evening as they worked by lamplight in the guild's hidden library. "The risks are enormous, and success is far from guaranteed." She looked up from the papyrus she was translating, her dark eyes reflecting the flame. "You're asking if I'm willing to die for this cause. The answer is yes, but that's the wrong question." "What's the right question?" "Are you willing to live for it? To accept the responsibility that comes with the power you're seeking?" She set down her stylus and moved closer. "I've seen what you're capable of, Alaric. You have knowledge that could reshape the world. The question is whether you have the wisdom to use it properly." The expedition finally departed Rome in the early spring, travelling as a merchant caravan to avoid suspicion. Besides Alaric and Cassia, the group included Gaius and 3 other guild members, along with Marcellus, a disgraced centurion who served as their military expert. The centurion had been cashiered from the legions for questioning orders during a particularly brutal campaign in Germania, but his skills remained sharp and his loyalty was absolute. The journey to Delphi took 2 weeks, following roads that were ancient when Rome was founded. As they travelled, Alaric began to understand the true scope of what they were attempting. The Vault of Kronos wasn't simply a repository of knowledge, but a functioning temporal laboratory, a place where the flow of time itself could be manipulated. "The ancients built it as a failsafe," Gaius explained as they camped in the shadow of Mount Parnassus. "They knew that their civilization would not last forever, so they created a place where their most important knowledge could be preserved and passed." Alaric found himself drawing on knowledge he hadn't known he possessed, insights that seemed to come from some deeper source than his Victorian education. The symbols that had been mysterious when he first encountered them on his sundial now made perfect sense, revealing themselves as a sophisticated notation system for temporal mathematics. The first major obstacle was a massive bronze door covered in rotating discs, each inscribed with astronomical symbols. The solution required calculating the exact celestial positions for the night of the winter solstice in the year the vault was built, a date that had to be deduced from the astronomical data encoded in the mechanism itself. Working by torchlight, with the constant fear of pursuit by the guardians of time, Alaric and Cassia spent hours working through the calculations. The mathematics were elegant but fiendishly complex, requiring an understanding of precession, orbital mechanics, and temporal distortion that pushed the limits of their knowledge. "There," Cassia said finally, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "If I'm right, the configuration should be Jupiter, in conjunction with Mars, with Venus rising at the moment of solstice." Alaric carefully adjusted the bronze discs, feeling the ancient mechanism respond to his touch. There was a moment of perfect silence, then a deep rumbling as counterweights shifted and gears engaged. The massive door swung open, revealing a corridor that stretched into darkness beyond the reach of their torches. The passage beyond was a marvel of engineering, its walls lined with bronze mirrors polished to perfection. As they advanced, Alaric realized that the mirrors were more than decoration. They were part of an optical computer, designed to perform calculations using reflected light. The patterns of reflection changed as they moved, creating displays of astronomical data that tracked their progress through the complex. The second obstacle was more subtle but equally challenging. The corridor split into multiple branches, each identical in appearance but leading to different destinations. There were no obvious clues to guide their choice, but Alaric gradually realized that the solution lay in understanding the nature of time itself. "It's not a maze," he said suddenly. "It's a demonstration. Each path represents a different understanding of temporal mechanics, and only one leads to truth." The correct path, he realized, was the one that acknowledged the paradoxical nature of time travel itself. By choosing the route that seemed to double back on itself, they found themselves approaching the heart of the vault, along a trajectory that satisfied the requirements of temporal consistency. The final chamber took Alaric's breath away. It was vast, carved from the living rock, and lit by some source that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. At its centre stood an orrery of impossible complexity, its bronze and gold spheres tracking the movements of celestial bodies with precision that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Around the walls, mechanical devices of every description hummed with quiet activity. Clocks, calculators, and machines whose purpose defied immediate understanding. But it was the central altar that drew Alaric's attention. Upon it sat a temporal anchor, identical to his own sundial, but complete and undamaged. The device pulsed with a faint luminescence, and the air around it seemed to shimmer with temporal distortion. "The master anchor," Gaius breathed. "We found it at last." As Alaric approached the altar, he could feel the device responding to his presence. The broken components of his own sundial grew warm in the bag where he carried them, resonating with their perfect counterpart. The mathematical patterns carved into the chamber's walls began to shift and change, displaying calculations that tracked his movement through time and space. "It's been waiting for you," Cassia whispered. "All these centuries it's been waiting for someone who could complete the work." Alaric reached out to touch the master anchor, and the moment his fingers made contact with its bronze surface, the world exploded into possibility. Visions flooded his consciousness, glimpses of potential futures, alternate histories, the vast web of causality that connected every moment to every other. He saw Rome triumphant, its legions marching through time itself to build an empire that spanned the centuries. He saw the fall of civilization, the long night of ignorance and superstition that would follow. He saw himself, older and wiser, using the power of the anchors to guide humanity toward wisdom rather than destruction. But with the visions came understanding of the true cost. The master anchor was not simply a tool but a burden, requiring constant vigilance to prevent its misuse. Those who wielded temporal power became responsible for all of history, their every decision rippling forward and backward through the centuries. "I can't," he said, pulling his hand back from the device. "The responsibility is too great. No one person should have such power." "Then you truly understand," said a voice from the shadows behind them. They turned to see a figure emerge from the darkness, an elderly man in robes that seemed to shift between the garb of a Roman philosopher and something far more ancient. His face was ageless in the way that suggested not youth, but a transcendence of temporal limitations entirely. "Who are you?" Alaric demanded, though something deep within him already knew the answer. "I am the guardian of this place, not one of those fanatics who hunt you, but the true guardian, appointed by those who built the vault to ensure that its power is used wisely." The figure approached the altar, and Alaric noticed that his feet cast no shadow on the luminescent floor. "I have waited through the centuries for someone to arrive who possessed both the knowledge to activate the master anchor and the wisdom to refuse its ultimate power." "Then the test was never about solving the puzzles," Cassia said with sudden understanding. "It was about what we would do when we reached the end." The Guardian nodded approvingly. "The ancients learned, through bitter experience, that temporal power corrupts absolutely. They built this place not as a repository of weapons, but as a school teaching each generation the same lesson, that true mastery lies not in the ability to change the past, but in the wisdom to accept it." Alaric felt the broken pieces of his sundial growing warmer in their bag. "But my anchor brought me here. Surely that was meant to serve some purpose." "It was. Your arrival has completed a cycle that began when the first temporal anchor was created. The knowledge you've gained, the understanding you've achieved, these were always the true treasures of the vault. The power to travel through time is nothing compared to the wisdom to know when such travel should be attempted." The Guardian moved to a section of wall covered in inscriptions that Alaric now realized were not decorative but functional, a vast database of temporal knowledge encoded in bronze and stone. "Your anchor can be repaired, but it will require a sacrifice. The master anchor must be used as a template, its perfect structure serving as a guide for the reconstruction, but the process will drain its power, leaving it inert." "You're asking me to destroy the master anchor to repair my own?" Alaric felt the weight of the decision crushing down upon him. "Why?" "Because your anchor is flawed, incomplete. It brought you here through accident rather than design, and it can return you home the same way. But the master anchor is too perfect, too powerful. In the wrong hands, it could unravel the very fabric of time itself." The sound of distant shouting echoed through the corridors, growing steadily closer. The guardians of time had found them at last. "We're out of time," Martellus said grimly, his hand moving to his sword. "They'll be here within minutes." The Guardian gestured toward a section of the chamber that Alaric hadn't noticed before, a raised platform surrounded by astronomical instruments of incredible complexity. "The repair must be done there, at the moment when the celestial alignments are perfect. Tonight, as it happens. The same solstice configuration that brought you here can take you home, but the window is narrow." Alaric looked at his companions, seeing in their faces the same mixture of fear and determination that he felt. Gaius appeared strangely at peace, as if he had always known this moment would come. Cassia's expression was harder to read, but there was something in her eyes that made his heart clench with sudden dread. "There's something else, isn't there?" he asked the Guardian. "Some other cost you haven't mentioned." The repair process requires a perfect understanding of temporal mathematics, an understanding that no single mind can contain. The knowledge must be distributed, shared among multiple consciousness, and then unified at the crucial moment. The Guardian's ancient eyes were filled with sorrow. Someone must remain behind to anchor the process from this end. Someone must sacrifice their own temporal existence to ensure yours. The shouting was closer now, accompanied by the ring of steel on stone as the fanatics fought their way through the vault's automated defences. Time was running out in more ways than one. "I'll do it," Gaius said without hesitation. "I'm old, and I've devoted my life to this moment. Let my sacrifice have meaning." "No," Cassia said firmly. "The calculations require someone younger, someone whose mind can handle the strain. I've studied the mathematics longer than anyone except Gaius himself." "Neither of you understands," the Guardian interrupted. "The sacrifice isn't death. It's worse. The person who anchors the process becomes temporally dispersed, their consciousness scattered across multiple timelines simultaneously. They become aware of every possible version of history, every choice that was made and every choice that could have been made. It's a form of existence, but one that no human mind was designed to endure." Alaric felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He had started this chain of events with his experiments in a London workshop, and the consequences had rippled outward to touch the lives of everyone around him. The rational thing would be to accept the sacrifice of one of his companions and return to his own time, but he found that he couldn't make that choice. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "Some alternative that doesn't require anyone to be destroyed." "There is," the Guardian said quietly. "You could remain here in this time and abandon your attempt to return home. The knowledge you've gained could be used to help Rome, to guide this civilization toward wisdom rather than destruction. But the cost would be accepting exile from your own era forever." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, punctuated by the crash of doors being forced open. The fanatics were almost upon them. "Alaric," Cassia said urgently, "you have to choose. There's no more time for deliberation." He looked at her, seeing in her face the love that had grown between them over the months of shared danger and discovery. She was offering him a future in this time, a life they could build together among the ruins of the ancient world. All he had to do was accept that his own era was lost to him forever. But as he weighed the choice, fragments of memory from his visions at the master anchor returned to him. He had seen the long night of ignorance that would follow Rome's fall, the centuries of darkness that his Victorian era was only beginning to emerge from. His knowledge, his understanding of temporal mechanics, these could indeed change history, but would the changes be for the better? "I can't," he said finally. "The temptation to interfere, to use my knowledge to change things, it would be too great. I would become exactly the kind of temporal tyrant that the ancients feared." The Guardian nodded approvingly, but before he could respond, the chamber's entrance exploded inward. Armed figures in dark robes poured through the opening, their faces hidden behind masks that bore the symbol of an hourglass with broken glass. The Custodes Temporis had found them at last. "Blasphemers!" their leader shouted, raising a bronze sword that gleamed with religious fervour. "You have violated the sacred order of time itself. The punishment is death." Marcellus stepped forward to meet them, his gladius appearing in his hand with practised ease. The sound of steel on steel rang through the chamber as he engaged the first wave of attackers, but there were too many of them, and his position was hopeless. "The platform!" the Guardian shouted over the din of battle. "Begin the repair now, while there's still time!" Alaric grabbed the components of his broken sundial and ran toward the astronomical platform, Cassia close behind him. The instruments there were unlike anything he had ever encountered, their bronze surfaces covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change as he watched. But somehow he understood their purpose. His consciousness expanded by contact with the master anchor to encompass knowledge he had never formally learned. Working with desperate haste, he began to align the broken pieces of his temporal anchor according to the patterns displayed on the ancient instruments. The mathematics were staggering in their complexity. Calculations that tracked the movement of every celestial body, accounted for the subtle distortions of space-time, and predicted the exact moment when the conditions for temporal transit would be perfect. Cassia worked beside him, her understanding of the ancient texts allowing her to interpret symbols that remained mysterious to him. Together, they began to reconstruct not just the physical device, but the mathematical framework that governed its operation. The battle raged around them as Gaius and the other guild members joined Marcellus in holding back the fanatics. But it was a losing fight. The Custodes Temporis were driven by religious fervour and outnumbered their opponents 3-1. Bodies began to fall, their blood staining the luminescent floor of the ancient chamber. "Almost there," Alaric muttered, adjusting the final gear into position. The sundial was taking shape again, its bronze components fitting together with the precision of master craftsmanship. But something was still missing, the final element that would complete the device and allow it to function. He felt in his pockets, searching for anything that might serve, and his fingers closed around his Victorian pocket watch. The timepiece that had survived his journey through the centuries, that had marked the hours of his captivity and exile, it contained components that were precisely what his temporal anchor needed. Without hesitation, he began to disassemble the watch, removing its springs and gears with the delicate touch of a master craftsman. The pieces fitted into the sundial's mechanism as if they had been designed for that purpose, completing circuits that had remained open for 2 millennia. The moment the final component clicked into place, the temporal anchor began to glow with the same luminescence that suffused the chamber. The astronomical instruments around the platform responded, their bronze surfaces displaying calculations that tracked the approaching moment of temporal opportunity. "Now," the Guardian shouted, "the alignment is perfect, but remember, someone must anchor the process from this end." Alaric looked around the chamber, seeing the desperate situation of his companions. Marcellus was down, his sword broken, blood streaming from a wound in his side. Gaius fought with the fury of desperation, but he was old and tiring rapidly. Only Cassia remained unengaged in the battle, standing beside the platform with her eyes fixed on the glowing sundial. "I'll do it," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the din of combat. "I understand the mathematics, and my mind is strong enough to handle the strain." "No." Alaric reached for her, but she stepped back, placing herself at the centre of the astronomical array. "There has to be another way. There is no other way, and you know it." Her smile was sad but resolute. "This is what I choose, Alaric. Let me choose." The sundial's glow intensified as the celestial alignment reached its peak. Around the chamber, the bronze mirrors began to focus their reflected light onto the platform, creating a network of energy that made the air itself shimmer with potential. The moment of transition was approaching rapidly. Cassia began to speak in a language that Alaric didn't recognize, her words following mathematical patterns that seemed to resonate with the fabric of space-time itself. As she spoke, her form began to blur, becoming translucent as her consciousness dispersed across multiple temporal dimensions. "Remember me?" she whispered, her voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Remember all of us." The last thing Alaric saw before the world dissolved around him was her face, beautiful and terrible in its sacrifice, as she gave up her singular existence to anchor his passage through time. Then the bronze mirrors flared with blinding light, the astronomical instrument screamed with harmonic resonance, and reality folded in on itself once again. He awoke in his London workshop to the familiar sound of coal smoke and fog pressing against the windows. The gaslight flickered exactly as he remembered, casting the same shadows across his cluttered workbench. His pocket watch, whole and undamaged, read midnight on December 22nd, exactly 24 hours after he had begun his experiment. But the sundial was gone. In its place on his workbench lay only a small gear of unknown metal, warm to the touch and inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. When he picked it up, he found that it had somehow embedded itself in his palm, becoming part of him in a way that was more than merely physical. The knowledge remained too. Everything he had learned in ancient Rome, every insight into the nature of time and causality, every moment of love and loss, all of it was preserved in his memory with perfect clarity. He was no longer simply Alaric Grayson, Victorian clockmaker, but something more complex. A man who had lived in 2 eras and understood the true cost of temporal power. On his desk, written in a hand he recognised with a pang of grief, was a scroll of papyrus that had not been there before his departure. Cassia's final gift to him, the story of her life after his departure, written in the scattered moments of consciousness that remained to her across the multiple timelines she now inhabited. She had lived, the scroll told him, though not in any way that could be called normal. Her sacrifice had dispersed her consciousness across every possible version of history, allowing her to witness the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of stars, the endless dance of cause and effect that governed the universe. She had become something between human and goddess, a guardian of temporal continuity who ensured that the most dangerous paradoxes were prevented. The scroll ended with words that brought tears to his eyes. "I have seen every possible future, my love, and in all of them, our sacrifice had meaning. The knowledge you carry back to your time will guide humanity toward wisdom, though the path will be long and difficult. Remember us not with sorrow but with joy, for we achieved something that no others in history have managed. We touched the very heart of time itself and found it good." The next morning brought Fletcher Moss to his door again, bearing word of another auction, another collection of mysterious artefacts from the ancient world. But this time, Alaric was ready. The gear embedded in his palm pulsed with warmth as he examined the dealer's offerings, revealing which items were authentic temporal devices and which were merely curious relics. "This one," he said, pointing to a bronze armillary sphere that looked unremarkable but sang with harmonic resonance to his enhanced senses. "And that, a Roman abacus that contained computational principles centuries ahead of its apparent age." "You've developed quite an eye," Fletcher observed with professional admiration. "Most collectors take years to develop such discrimination." Alaric smiled, thinking of Cassia and her patient instruction in the mathematical principles that governed temporal mechanics. "I've had good teachers." As the weeks passed, Alaric began to understand the true scope of his mission. The knowledge he had gained in ancient Rome was not meant to be hoarded but shared, disseminated carefully among those who could use it responsibly. He began to write, crafting papers on advanced mathematics and mechanical engineering that pushed the boundaries of Victorian science without revealing their true source. The Royal Society received his treatise on harmonic resonance and precision timekeeping with considerable interest. The principles he outlined, while theoretically sound, seemed to spring from nowhere, mathematical insights that had no clear precedent in existing literature. When pressed for the source of his inspiration, Alaric claimed to have discovered them in fragmentary Roman texts, a story that was plausible if unlikely. More papers followed. On the mechanical computation of astronomical phenomena, principles of temporal measurement in ancient civilizations, and the mathematical foundations of historical chronology. Each one contained insights that were decades ahead of their time, carefully disguised as scholarly speculation rather than hard-won knowledge. But it was his private work that truly mattered. In the evenings, when his official correspondence was complete, Alaric laboured on a comprehensive treatise on temporal mechanics, the complete theory of time travel as understood by the Roman Mechanist Guild, expanded and refined by his own experiences. The work was too dangerous to publish, but it would serve as a guide for future generations who might encounter the same mysteries he had faced. He also began to collect, using his enhanced understanding to identify and acquire genuine temporal artifacts before they could fall into dangerous hands. The gear in his palm served as an infallible detector, warming in the presence of devices that could manipulate time and remaining cool near mere curiosities. Slowly, carefully, he built a collection that rivaled the holdings of the Vault of Kronos itself. The work was lonely. There was no one in his own era who could understand what he had experienced, no one who could appreciate the sacrifices that had been made to bring him home. He thought often of Cassia, wondering if somewhere in the vast web of alternate timelines she was aware of his efforts. The gear in his palm would sometimes grow warm without apparent cause, and he chose to interpret this as her presence, watching over him from her dispersed existence across the centuries. Years passed. Alaric's reputation as a scholar grew, his papers cited by the leading scientists of the age. But none of them suspected that their respected colleague was working from knowledge gained in an era that had ended more than a millennium before their birth. The future that Cassia had seen in her visions began to take shape as humanity slowly absorbed the insights he provided, advancing toward wisdom rather than mere technological power. On the 10th anniversary of his return, Alaric made a pilgrimage to the British Museum, where fragments of Roman civilization were displayed for the education and entertainment of Victorian society. Among the bronze artifacts and marble statues, he found a small case containing items recently acquired from excavations near Delphi. Most were unremarkable: pottery shards, coins, fragments of inscriptions, but one piece made his breath catch in his throat. It was a small bronze gear, identical to the one embedded in his palm, inscribed with the same symbols that hurt to look at directly. The museum's placard identified it simply as mechanical component, Roman period, unknown purpose. But Alaric knew what it was: a piece of the master anchor, somehow preserved through the centuries and finally making its way to London. As he stood before the display case, the gear in his palm grew warm, resonating with its ancient counterpart. For a moment, he thought he could hear Cassia's voice whispering across the centuries, speaking words of love and encouragement that only he could understand. "Time is not a river," he murmured, remembering the words that had ended his original outline so long ago. "It's a machine, and I intend to build a key." But now he understood that the key was not a physical device but knowledge itself, the understanding that time's greatest power lay not in the ability to change the past but in the wisdom to shape the future. The machine of time was already built, had always existed, and his role was not to master it but to serve it, ensuring that its immense power was used for the betterment of all humanity. The fog pressed against the museum's windows as he made his way home through the gaslit streets of London, carrying with him the weight of centuries and the hope of ages yet to come. Behind him, in their glass cases, the artifacts of Rome waited silently for the next scholar who might be wise enough to understand their true purpose. And somewhere in the vast web of time, Cassia watched and smiled, knowing that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The brass watch lay heavy in Archibald Whitmore's palm as he traced the intricate engravings with his slender finger. The timepiece had once belonged to his father, like everything else in this dusty workshop hidden beneath the floorboards of their modest country home. 17 years of life had taught Archibald patience, a virtue necessary for a boy who spent his days repairing pocket watches, while other lads his age worked the fields or courted village girls. But patience was also essential for someone trying to decode the secrets of a man who had vanished 5 years ago, leaving behind nothing but peculiar contraptions and fragmented journals. Rain tapped gently against the small window near the ceiling of his hidden sanctuary. Outside, the English countryside of 1873 was enveloped in one of those dense autumn fogs that seemed to swallow everything beyond one's immediate surroundings. Archibald preferred it this way. The isolation suited him, kept the curious eyes of Millfield's residents from prying too deeply into his affairs. They already whispered about the odd Whitmore boy who kept to himself and spoke in terms and concepts beyond his years. Just like his father, they'd say, though never within earshot. Brilliant, but touched in the head. Archibald adjusted the small brass magnifying glass attached to his workbench lamp and carefully placed the back panel of a pocket watch into position. His fingers, despite their youth, moved with the practiced precision of a master craftsman. He had inherited his father's mechanical intuition, along with his dark, unruly hair and penetrating grey eyes that now narrowed in concentration as he guided a tiny screwdriver with surgical precision. "There now," he muttered to himself, as the watch began ticking with a satisfying rhythm. "Back to life you go." He allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction, then placed the repaired watch on a velvet cushion beside 6 others, all commissions from townsfolk who begrudgingly admitted that, peculiar though he might be, young Whitmore had a gift for breathing life back into timepieces others had declared beyond salvation. It was this skill that kept a roof over his head and food on his table, since his mother had followed his father into whatever mysterious beyond had claimed them both. Archibald stretched his stiff shoulders and glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner, a magnificent piece his father had built from scratch, its pendulum swinging with hypnotic constancy. Nearly midnight. He should retire, but sleep rarely came easily to him, and tonight something else nagged at his consciousness, a feeling he couldn't quite identify, like the subtle off-rhythm tick of a watch with a hairspring just beginning to fail. His gaze drifted to the far corner of the workshop, to a locked cabinet he seldom opened. Inside lay the stranger pieces of his father's legacy. mechanisms and devices that served no obvious purpose, contraptions that seemed to defy the very laws of mechanics as they were understood. Most mysterious of all was the rusted, gear-laden device Archibald had discovered hidden in a lead-lined box beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in oilcloth and accompanied by a note in his father's handwriting bearing only 3 words, "Never fully assemble." Perhaps it was the melancholy brought by the anniversary of his father's disappearance, or simply the restlessness of a mind too active for slumber. But tonight, Archibald found himself retrieving the key to that forbidden cabinet from its hiding place inside the hollowed-out spine of Newton's Principia. The tumblers clicked softly as he turned the key, and the cabinet door swung open with a protesting creak. The device lay exactly as he had last seen it, incomplete, mysterious, alluring in its complexity. Unlike his father's other creations, this one bore no signature mark, no initials or date of completion. Instead, its brass and copper surface was etched with symbols that resembled no alphabet Archibald had ever encountered, interspersed with Roman numerals that followed no logical sequence he could discern. The central mechanism, a nested arrangement of gears surrounding what appeared to be a small glass chamber, remained unassembled, just as his father had left it. Archibald lifted it carefully and carried it to his workbench. "What were you building, father?" he whispered, as if the man might somehow answer from whatever realm had claimed him. What purpose could this possibly serve? For hours he examined the device, sketching its components, measuring the tolerance of its gears, attempting to deduce the logic behind its design. The fog outside thickened and the rain intensified, drumming in irregular rhythm against the window that contrasted with the perfect regularity of the grandfather clock's ticking. Occasionally distant thunder rumbled across the countryside. As the night deepened, Archibald's eyelids grew heavy, but his curiosity remained insatiable. He found himself placing gears that seemed to match, testing alignments, making adjustments with tools designed for the delicate work of watchmaking. Each piece that slipped into place seemed to make the device hum with a strange energy he attributed to his exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. The grandfather clock struck 3, each sonorous gong reverberating through the workshop. Archibald's attention had narrowed to a laser focus on the final assembly of the mysterious device. Only one piece remained, a gear with teeth unlike any conventional design, appearing almost crystalline in the lamplight. As he held it above the central chamber, preparing to seat it into position, lightning flashed outside, momentarily flooding the workshop with harsh blue-white light. In that instant, Archibald noticed something extraordinary. The symbols etched along the rim of the device seemed to shift and rearrange themselves, like text viewed through moving water. The Roman numerals glowed with a faint luminescence that couldn't possibly be a reflection of his lamp. His heart began to pound in his chest, a mixture of fear and exhilaration flooding his veins. The rational part of his mind urged caution, reminded him of his father's explicit warning, but another part, the part that had always driven him to understand, to know, to unravel mysteries, pushed his hand forward. The final gear slipped into place with a sound like a key turning in a lock. For a moment nothing happened. Then the central glass chamber began to fill with what appeared to be liquid moonlight, a silvery, mercury-like substance that rose from nowhere. The gears began to turn of their own accord, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Archibald tried to back away, but found himself unable to move, as if some invisible force held him rooted to the spot. The device's ticking grew louder, synchronized perfectly with the grandfather clock and, most disturbingly, with Archibald's own heartbeat. The 3 rhythms merged into one pulsing sound that seemed to bend the very air of the workshop. The symbols and numerals on the device now glowed bright enough to cast shadows, rotating around the rim like constellations in an accelerated night sky. "No!" Archibald gasped, finally breaking free of his paralysis and reaching for the device, intending to dismantle it before whatever was happening progressed further. But as his fingers touched the now hot metal, a shock ran up his arm, and the workshop around him seemed to fracture like a mirror struck by a stone. Reality itself appeared to be cracking along invisible seams. The last thing Archibald Whitmore saw before consciousness left him was the device floating inches above his workbench, surrounded by a corona of impossible light. The last thing he felt was his body stretching, tearing, reconstituting. as if every atom were being pulled apart and reassembled incorrectly. The last thing he heard was the synchronized ticking suddenly stopping, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the universe itself. And then, nothing. Pain came first, sharp, insistent, pulling Archibald from the void. His face pressed against something cold and wet. Mud. His nostrils filled with smells his brain couldn't immediately categorize. Acrid smoke. Something metallic and organic that turned his stomach, and underneath it all the reek of unwashed bodies and excrement. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine, but through it he could make out sounds. Distant explosions, shouting, the mechanical stutter of, were those guns? Forcing his eyes open, Archibald tried to process what he was seeing. Grey sky. Brown earth churned into a nightmare landscape. Barbed wire stretched across a wasteland of craters and splintered tree trunks. None of it made sense. Had he hit his head? Was he dreaming? He tried to push himself up and realized his clothing felt wrong, heavier, rougher. Looking down at himself, he saw not his familiar waistcoat and trousers, but a mud-caked uniform of unfamiliar design. Parts of it seemed fused with his own clothing, as if two sets of garments had melded together during some impossible process. On his chest, partly embedded in the fabric as if it had materialized there, was his father's watch, the one he kept in his waistcoat pocket, not the mysterious device. Before he could further examine his situation, the ground beneath him shook violently. A deafening explosion sent dirt and debris raining down around him. Instinctively, he covered his head with his arms and tried to make himself smaller. "Get down, you bloody fool!" The voice came from somewhere to his left, followed by a rough hand grabbing his collar and yanking him sideways. Archibald tumbled into a deep trench, landing hard against its muddy wall. Looking up, he found himself staring into the dirt-streaked face of a man perhaps 10 years his senior, wearing a uniform similar to the one now mysteriously adorning Archibald's own body. "Are you trying to get your head blown off?" the man demanded, his accent marking him as a Londoner. "Fritz is shelling the whole sector. Everyone back to the dugouts." Archibald opened his mouth, but no words came. His mind raced, trying to assemble the pieces of this impossible puzzle. The landscape, the uniforms, the weapons, they were unlike anything he had ever seen, yet somehow familiar from books, or perhaps his father's more esoteric journals. Where am I?" he finally managed, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. The soldier gave him a look that mingled irritation with concern. "Took some shrapnel to the head, did you? You're on the Western Front, mate. Somme offensive. Now move your ass before we both end up in pieces." Western Front? Somme? The terms meant nothing to Archibald, yet the urgency in the man's voice compelled him to scramble to his feet and follow as another explosion rocked the earth nearby. They moved along the trench, a deep zigzagging channel reinforced with wooden planks and sandbags, passing other men in similar uniforms who crouched against the walls or huddled in small recesses. The scene was something from a fever dream, or one of the more vivid descriptions of hell from Milton's Paradise Lost. Men caked in mud, many sporting bandages stained with blood and worse. The air thick with smoke and the smell of cordite. Constant, thunder-like booming in the distance, punctuated by sharper cracks and the occasional scream. Archibald was guided, half pushed really, into a wider section of the trench system where wooden supports created something resembling a room dug into the earth. Men sat on ammunition crates or directly on the duckboard floor, some playing cards, others writing letters, many simply staring into space with vacant expressions that suggested their minds had retreated to safer territories than their bodies currently occupied. "Found this one wandering in no man's land," his rescuer announced to the group. "Seems a bit dazed. Anyone know which company he's with?" The men glanced up, eyes passing over Archibald with minimal interest before returning to their previous occupations. Only one, an older man with a sergeant's stripes and a face weathered beyond its years, gave him more than a cursory examination. "Don't recognise him," the sergeant said, "but uniforms are all so caked in mud now, hard to tell which lot he belongs to. Could be one of the replacements that came in last night." He addressed Archibald directly. "What's your name and unit, soldier?" "Archibald Whitmore," he replied automatically, then hesitated. Unit? He had no unit, no military training, no business being in what was clearly some kind of battlefield. Yet here he stood, wearing a uniform surrounded by men who seemed to accept his presence, even if they couldn't place him. I'm not certain, he added, deciding that confusion might be his best defence until he could make sense of his situation. There was an explosion. I don't remember much before that. The sergeant's expression softened slightly. Shell shock. Seen it before. He turned to the man who had brought Archibald in. Put him with Barker's group. They're down 3 men after yesterday's push. He can sort himself out there until the medical officers can have a look at him. Archibald was led deeper into the trench system, his mind racing to process everything. Shell shock. The Western Front. Somme. These terms, combined with the weapons and uniforms he was seeing, began to coalesce into a horrifying possibility. He had read enough history to recognise the hallmarks of warfare, but this was like nothing from his own time. His own time. The thought struck him with the force of the explosion still rocking the earth above. Was it possible? Had that device, his father's mysterious contraption with its rune-like etchings and impossible mechanics, somehow thrown him forward in time? It seemed absurd, the stuff of H.G. Wells's scientific romances, yet no other explanation presented itself. What year is it? He asked his guide, trying to keep his voice casual despite the existential dread building in his chest. The man gave him a sidelong glance. Christ, mate, you really did get your bell rung, didn't you? It's 1916. July, if you've lost track of that too. 1916. The number hit Archibald like a physical blow. 43 years. Somehow he had travelled 43 years into the future and landed in the middle of what must be a war of unprecedented scale, judging by what little he could see from the trenches. A war enveloping nations, perhaps even continents. What calamity had befallen the world during those lost decades? Before he could pursue this line of thought further, they reached another dugout where a group of about 8 men were engaged in the mundane tasks of warfare. Cleaning rifles, mending uniforms, eating from tin containers. They looked up with the same disinterested expressions he had encountered in the previous group. "New one for you, Barker," his guide announced to a stocky, red-faced man who appeared to be in charge. "Found him wandering above. Bit scrambled in the head, but the sergeant says he's yours now." Barker looked Archibald up and down with a critical eye. "Can you shoot?" he asked bluntly. Archibald had fired his father's old hunting rifle exactly twice in his life, both times at targets and with minimal success. "Not well," he admitted. "Can you run messages without getting lost?" I believe I could manage that. Can you follow orders without getting yourself or the rest of us killed?" Archibald swallowed hard. "Yes, sir," Barker snorted. "I'm not an officer, thank Christ. Corporal will do." He pointed to an empty space along the wall. "That's your spot. Jenkins, Hawkins and Murray won't be needing theirs anymore, so take what you need from their kits. Food comes twice a day if we're lucky. Water when you can get it. Keep your head down, do as you're told, and you might live long enough to remember your own name." He turned back to the others, dismissing Archibald from his attention. "Stand to in 30 minutes, lads. Check your ammunition." Left to his own devices, Archibald made his way to the indicated spot where 3 packs lay untouched, their owners presumably among the countless dead this war was creating. The thought of looting from the deceased turned his stomach, but survival instinct overwhelmed moral qualms. He needed to understand this new reality, and more importantly, find a way back to his own time. As he sat examining the contents of the packs, finding items both familiar and foreign, from tobacco pouches to gas masks whose purpose he could only guess at, his hand strayed to the watch embedded in his uniform. It still ticked, but something about its rhythm seemed off, as if it were keeping time to a different clock altogether. Opening it, he noticed the second hand moving in tiny stutters, rather than the smooth sweep it should have exhibited. More concerning were the face and hands, which occasionally seemed to blur and duplicate themselves, showing 2 slightly different times simultaneously, before resolving back into a single image. It was as if the watch itself was caught between moments, unsure of its place in the time stream. First time at the front? The question startled Archibald from his examination. Looking up, he saw a thin-faced man with kindly eyes watching him from a few feet away. "Is it that obvious?" Archibald replied, attempting to strike a balance between the truth and what would be believable to these men. The soldier chuckled softly. "You've got that look, like you've woken up in someone else's nightmare." He extended a hand. "Private Thomas Cooper, formerly a carpenter from Bristol, currently expendable infantry in His Majesty's forces." Archibald accepted the handshake. Archibald Whitmore. Unusual name that, not many Archibalds in the ranks. Where are you from? Millfield, Archibald answered automatically. Small village in Hertfordshire. Cooper nodded. Never heard of it, but England's full of places I've never heard of. I joined up with 5 other lads from my street. I'm the only one still breathing. He said this matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather rather than the obliteration of his friends. Archibald struggled to find an appropriate response, but was saved by a commotion at the entrance to the dugout. A man in a more elaborate uniform, an officer, Archibald presumed, ducked inside, accompanied by another soldier carrying a large metal container. Mail and rations, the officer announced. Cooper, Barker, Simmons, Whitmore and Wells. You're on patrol tonight. Western section of the line needs reconnoitring after today's barrage. Report to Lieutenant Hadley at dusk. Archibald felt his heart sink. Patrol? In this hellscape of artillery and barbed wire? He had no training, no knowledge of military protocols, barely even understood the conflict he'd been dropped into. Yet refusing would surely raise suspicions he couldn't afford if he hoped to find a way home. As the officer departed and the men fell upon the rations with desperate enthusiasm, Cooper nudged Archibald. Stick close to me tonight, he said quietly. First patrol's always the worst. I'll show you the ropes. Gratitude flooded through Archibald. Thank you. I'm afraid I'm rather out of my depth here. Cooper's smile held no humour. We all are, mate. Not a man in these trenches was born for this madness. We're butchers and bakers and candlestick makers playing at being soldiers, because some men in fine offices decided our lives were worth less than their pride. He handed Archibald a tin of something that might generously be called stew. Eat. You'll need your strength. As Archibald forced down the unidentifiable contents of the tin, he observed his new companions more carefully. They moved differently than the men he had known, more cautious, more contained, as if conserving energy for the next crisis. Their eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, never fully relaxing even in this relative safety. These were men who had seen horrors Archibald could scarcely imagine, who had been fundamentally changed by their experiences. What must it be like, he wondered, to live with the constant expectation of violence and death, to know that at any moment steel and fire might rain from the sky and end your existence. It seemed a form of torture more cruel than anything devised in the darkest dungeons of history. As the day wore on, Archibald tried to glean as much information as possible without revealing his complete ignorance. He learned they were indeed in France, near a river called the Somme, fighting against Germany and its allies in what the men variously called the Great War, or, with bitter irony, the war to end all wars. The conflict had been raging for nearly 2 years already, with no end in sight and casualties mounting by the thousands each day. The sheer scale of it boggled Archibald's mind. In his time, wars were relatively limited affairs fought by professional armies, not this industrial slaughter engulfing entire nations. What had happened to the world he knew? What series of events had led humanity to this precipice? Moreover, what had his father's device truly done? Had it somehow predicted this future and sent Archibald forward to witness it? Was there a purpose to his displacement, or was he simply the victim of forces beyond his understanding? As these questions swirled in his mind, the distant thunder of artillery continued unabated. Occasionally the earth would shake as a shell landed particularly close to their position, sending cascades of dirt raining down from the dugout ceiling. The men barely reacted to these near misses, so commonplace had they become. As evening approached, the call came for Stand To, a ritual, Archibald learned, where every man manned the firing line at dawn and dusk, the most likely times for enemy attack. He followed Cooper up a series of wooden steps to the trench proper, where they took positions along a raised platform that allowed them to peer cautiously over a wall of sandbags. The sight that greeted him was beyond anything his nightmares could have conjured. The land between the opposing trench lines, no man's land, Cooper called it, stretched perhaps 200 yards to another set of earthworks barely visible in the gathering darkness. The intervening space was a lunar landscape of shell craters, tangles of barbed wire, and the unmistakable shapes of human bodies in various states of decomposition. Some had clearly been there for days or weeks, rotting in the summer heat, providing grim landmarks in this geography of death. Don't look at them too long, Cooper advised quietly, noticing Archibald's horrified gaze fixed on a particularly visible corpse. It doesn't help them, and it doesn't help you. Archibald tore his eyes away with effort. How? How do you bear it? He asked, his voice barely audible over the distant gunfire. Cooper was silent for a long moment. You don't, he finally replied. Not really. You just pretend to. You build walls in your mind, put all this, he gestured at the devastation before them, on the other side, and you pray those walls hold until you can go home. He paused, then added, if home still exists when this is over. They stood their watch in silence after that, each lost in his own thoughts. When the order came to stand down, they returned to the dugout to prepare for the night patrol. Archibald was issued a rifle, a Lee Enfield, Cooper informed him, which felt impossibly heavy and awkward in his hands. A steel helmet, a canteen of water, emergency rations and various other items were added to his gear until he felt like a pack horse rather than a soldier. As they waited for the appointed hour, Archibald found himself studying his pocket watch again. The anomalies he'd noticed earlier seemed to be intensifying. Now the face occasionally displayed impossible configurations, hours that didn't exist, minute hands moving backward, second hands that split and followed different paths simultaneously. More disturbing still, when these glitches occurred, Archibald experienced brief but intense disorientation, as if his consciousness itself were stuttering like the watch's mechanism. During one such episode, the dugout around him seemed to freeze entirely. Men caught in mid-motion, smoke from cigarettes hanging motionless in the air, even dust motes suspended as if embedded in glass. For what felt like several seconds but could have been less, Archibald alone moved in a world turned to a tableau. Then reality snapped back with a sensation like a rubber band breaking, leaving him gasping and dizzy. None of the others appeared to have noticed anything amiss, continuing their preparations without pause. "Are you all right?" Cooper asked, concern evident in his voice. "You've gone white as a sheet." "Just nerves," Archibald managed, unwilling to voice what he had experienced. Either he was losing his mind, a distinct possibility given the circumstances, or something far stranger was occurring. Either way, now was not the time to explore it further. At precisely 2200 hours, their patrol assembled near a communication trench that would lead them to their designated sector. Lieutenant Hadley, a gaunt man with tired eyes who couldn't have been much older than 25, briefed them quickly and efficiently. "We need to assess damage to the wire in sectors 4 through 6, and determine if Fritz has moved his forward positions during the confusion of today's barrage," he explained, pointing to locations on a mud-smeared map. "No heroics, no unnecessary engagements. We observe, we report back. Questions." There were none. The 5 men checked their weapons one final time, blackened any exposed skin with burnt cork to reduce visibility, and followed Hadley into the darkness. Moving through the trenches at night was a disorienting experience. The zigzagging passages seemed designed to confuse, and the occasional flare fired from either side cast strange, shifting shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Archibald focused on Cooper's back, trusting the more experienced soldier to guide him safely. They reached a point where the trench system ended at a ladder leading up to ground level. Hadley went first, peering cautiously over the edge before signalling the all clear. One by one they followed, crouching low as they emerged into no man's land. The reality of this blasted territory was even more horrifying up close. Shell craters, some filled with stagnant water, pockmarked the earth like smallpox scars. The twisted metal of barbed wire entanglements reflected what little moonlight penetrated the clouds. And everywhere, the detritus of battle, broken rifles, shredded equipment, and worst of all, the omnipresent dead, their forms often reduced to unrecognizable heaps of cloth and flesh. They moved in a loose formation, communicating through hand signals Archibald barely understood, but desperately tried to mimic. The night was surprisingly loud. Distant machine guns stuttered, artillery boomed on the horizon, and occasionally the haunting cry of a wounded man calling for help drifted across the battlefield. As they approached the first section of wire they were to inspect, Archibald's watch began to behave erratically again. The ticking increased in volume until it seemed impossibly loud in his ears, drowning out even the sounds of war around them. The hands spun wildly, and the face glowed with the same unearthly light he had seen emanating from his father's device just before his displacement. Then, without warning, the world around him changed. The night remained, but the battlefield transformed. Where moments before there had been cratered earth and tangled wire, now Archibald saw grassy fields under moonlight, unmarred by war's devastation. In the distance, instead of trench lines, peaceful farmhouses stood with soft light glowing from their windows. He blinked, and the vision vanished, reality snapping back to its war-torn state. But something had changed. His patrol companions were frozen in mid-stride, as motionless as figures in a photograph. Even the flares that had been drifting slowly earthward hung suspended in the air, their light creating statuary from the surrounding landscape. Archibald's heart pounded in his chest as he realised he was experiencing another temporal anomaly, but this one far more pronounced than before. Was this what his father's device was designed to create? Fissures in the fabric of time itself? Before he could further contemplate the implications, reality fractured again. Now he saw multiple overlapping scenes like double-exposed photographs. The battlefield as it currently existed, yes, but also glimpses of what it had been before, peaceful farmland, and more disturbingly what it might become, a memorial site with stone markers and trim grass, visitors walking solemnly among monuments to the fallen. The watch in his hand burned hot suddenly, forcing him to release it. Rather than falling, it remained suspended in the air before him, ticking so rapidly the sound became a continuous hum. Around him, time itself seemed to stutter and skip like a damaged gramophone reel. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the phenomenon ceased. The watch dropped into the mud, reality solidified, and his companions resumed their movement as if nothing had occurred. To them, perhaps nothing had. The entire episode might have transpired in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Archibald retrieved his watch with trembling fingers, noticing that while it now ticked normally, the hands pointed to an impossible hour, 13 o'clock, before suddenly resetting to the correct time. Whatever was happening to him, it was escalating and somehow connected to both the watch and the device that had sent him here. "Keep up," Cooper hissed, dropping back to nudge Archibald forward. "Wool gathering will get you killed out here." Forcing his mind back to the immediate danger, Archibald followed the patrol as they completed their assessment of the wire emplacements. They were perhaps halfway through their assignment when Hadley raised a fist, the signal to freeze. Everyone dropped to the ground, pressing themselves into the mud. In the silence that followed, Archibald heard what had alerted the lieutenant, voices speaking in a language he didn't recognise but assumed must be German. The enemy patrol was nearby, perhaps on a mission similar to their own. For long minutes they remained motionless, barely breathing. The German voices grew closer, then began to fade as the patrol apparently moved in a different direction. Hadley was just beginning to signal they should continue when a flare burst overhead, bathing the landscape in harsh white light. "Down!" someone whispered urgently, but it was too late. They had been spotted. The night erupted with the chatter of machine gun fire. Dirt kicked up in a line marching toward their position as the German gunner adjusted his aim. Hadley shouted something Archibald couldn't make out over the din, but the intent was clear: run or die. The patrol scattered, each man making for the nearest shell hole or depression that might offer cover. Archibald found himself sprinting alongside Cooper, zigzagging to present a more difficult target as bullets whined past them. They dove into a water-filled crater just as another flare burst above, followed by intensified gunfire. "Stay down," Cooper panted, loading a fresh magazine into his rifle. "They'll have to expose themselves to get a clear shot. When they do..." He left the implication hanging. Archibald nodded mutely, clutching his own rifle, but knowing he lacked the skill to use it effectively. The cold, fetid water of the crater soaked through his uniform, but fear kept him from noticing the discomfort. Somewhere nearby, a man screamed. One of their patrol caught in the open, perhaps. As Cooper cautiously raised his head to assess their situation, Archibald's watch began its now familiar malfunction. The ticking accelerated, the face glowed, and the hands spun wildly. He tried to warn Cooper, to explain what was happening, but found himself unable to speak as the air around them seemingly thickened into something with the consistency of syrup. Time slowed, stretched, then stopped altogether. Cooper remained frozen in mid-motion, his features locked in an expression of grim determination. The water in the crater ceased to ripple. Even the tracer rounds from the machine gun hung suspended in the air like deadly fireflies. In this moment outside of time, Archibald became aware of something extraordinary. He could move, not just himself, but objects around him. He reached out and touched one of the suspended bullets, finding it solid and hot to the touch. With careful pressure, he was able to nudge it slightly off its trajectory. An idea formed in his mind, a desperate, possibly insane idea. If he could alter the path of one bullet during this temporal anomaly, what else might he change? Could he affect the outcome of the firefight? Perhaps save lives that would otherwise be lost? With trembling hands, he reached for other suspended projectiles, diverting them away from where he and Cooper crouched. It was painstaking work, requiring both physical and mental effort that left him gasping. Each bullet he touched seemed to resist his interference, as if reality itself objected to his meddling. As he worked, he became aware of a strange phenomenon. After images, or ghosts of events that had not yet occurred. He could see hazy outlines of Cooper raising his rifle and firing, of German soldiers advancing across no man's land, of blood blooming from wounds not yet inflicted. It was as if the immediate future existed as a probability field that he could perceive while in this suspended state. More disturbing still, he noticed thin, fracture-like lines in the air itself, visible only when he moved his head in certain ways, catching the light of the frozen flares. They resembled cracks in glass, spreading outward from his position like a spider's web. Were these physical manifestations of the damage he was doing to the time stream by his very presence, let alone his interference? Before he could consider the implications further, he felt a sharp pain in his chest, radiating outward from where the watch pressed against his skin. The timepiece had grown searingly hot, burning through fabric to leave its imprint on his flesh. The pain broke his concentration, and reality shuddered around him. Time resumed its normal flow with a sensation like a physical blow. The redirected bullets flew off in their new trajectories, missing their targets. Cooper fired his rifle without seeming to notice anything amiss. The German machine gun fell silent, its operators perhaps confused by their sudden inability to hit what should have been easy targets. "Now!" Cooper shouted, grabbing Archibald's arm. "Back to our lines while they're regrouping." They scrambled from the crater and ran in a crouch toward where they believed their trenches lay. In the darkness and confusion, Archibald quickly became disoriented, but trusted Cooper's instincts. Behind them, German voices shouted in alarm, followed by renewed gunfire that seemed to lack the precision of earlier volleys. They reached a stretch of barbed wire that marked the approach to the British lines. Cooper called out a password that Archibald couldn't quite catch, and answering voices guided them to a gap in the defences. Hands reached out to pull them into the relative safety of the forward trench. "Where are the others?" an officer demanded as they collapsed against the mud wall, gasping for breath. Cooper shook his head grimly. "Scattered when the machine gun opened up. Simmons took a hit, I think. Didn't see the lieutenant or the rest after that." The officer cursed under his breath. "Stay here until the all clear. We'll send out a recovery party at dawn if they haven't made it back by then." As the adrenaline of their escape began to fade, Archibald became aware of how thoroughly exhausted he was. Every muscle ached, and his lungs burned from exertion, and the acrid smoke that hung perpetually in the air. More concerning, though, was the throbbing pain where the watch had burned him. A perfect circular imprint now branded into his chest. Cooper noticed his discomfort. "You hit?" "No," Archibald replied, not sure how to explain what had actually happened. "Just winded." Cooper nodded, accepting the explanation without further question. First time under fire is always the worst. Gets easier. He paused, then amended, "Not better. Just easier." They made their way back to their dugout, where the remaining members of Barker's group greeted their return with minimal acknowledgement, relief tempered by the knowledge that survival today meant nothing for tomorrow. Archibald collapsed onto his designated space, too exhausted even to remove his mud-caked boots. Sleep, when it came, brought no respite. His dreams were a kaleidoscope of temporal fragments, visions of his workshop in 1873, glimpses of the battlefield in various states of destruction and reconstruction, and most disturbingly, flashes of what seemed to be other wars, other conflicts stretching both backward and forward in time. In each, the same pattern repeated, men killing and dying for causes that would be forgotten before the blood dried on the ground. He awoke with a start to the sound of the morning artillery barrage, the daily hate, as Cooper called it when he handed Archibald a tin cup of something approximating tea. Weak sunlight filtered through the entrance to the dugout, suggesting it was perhaps 7 or 8 in the morning. "Barker wants you on messenger duty today," Cooper informed him. "Probably figures you're not ready for the firing line after last night. Report to the command post after stand 2. Archibald nodded gratefully, still struggling to fully wake. As he sipped the tepid tea, he surreptitiously examined his watch. It appeared normal now, ticking with reassuring regularity, though the face seemed subtly altered. The numerals more deeply etched, the hands slightly more ornate. He wondered if these changes were physical manifestations of whatever temporal disturbances the device was experiencing, or merely tricks his exhausted mind was playing on him. The burn on his chest throbbed in time with the watch's ticking, creating an unsettling connection between his flesh and the timepiece. When he touched the wound through his shirt, he felt an echo of the strange sensations he had experienced during the temporal anomaly in No Man's Land. A stretching of perception, a blurring of moments into one another. After the morning stand 2, Archibald made his way through the trench network to the command post, a slightly more substantial dugout reinforced with corrugated iron and containing actual furniture in the form of a map table and several chairs. There, a harried lieutenant handed him a sealed envelope and terse instructions to deliver it to a Captain Blackwood at a forward observation post half a mile down the line. The journey through the communication trenches was physically demanding, ducking under low-hanging support beams, navigating around work parties, repairing collapsed sections, occasionally pressing himself against the wall to allow stretcher-bearers carrying the wounded to pass. The entire network of trenches formed a grotesque parody of a city's streets, complete with intersections marked by crude signposts bearing names like Piccadilly and Oxford Street. Bleak humour from men desperate to impose some familiarity on this alien landscape. As he travelled, Archibald attempted to organise his thoughts about his situation. The evidence suggested that his father's device had indeed created some kind of temporal displacement, throwing him decades into the future. But why here? Why now? Was it random chance that had deposited him in the middle of this particular hell, or was there purpose behind it? More pressing was the question of how to return to his own time. The device itself remained in 1873, presumably still on his workshop table. All he had was his pocket watch, which seemed somehow linked to the temporal disturbances he was experiencing, but offered no obvious means of controlling them. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, unusual in their rhythm and heaviness. Looking up, he saw a most unexpected sight. A woman making her way confidently through the trench, dressed in the uniform of a nurse. She was perhaps in her late 20s, with intelligent eyes and a face that, while not conventionally beautiful, possessed a striking quality of determination. She nodded to Archibald as she passed, then paused, her gaze lingering on him with sudden interest. "You're new," she stated rather than asked, her accent marking her as educated and possibly upper class. "Yes," he replied, uncertain what else to say. "Archibald Whitmore." "Charlotte Winters," she returned, extending a hand which Archibald shook after a moment's hesitation. Physical contact with women outside his immediate family wasn't common in his era, but he remembered enough about social niceties to recognise the gesture. "I'm with the voluntary aid detachment at the clearing station back there. Haven't seen you before." "I just arrived," he said carefully. Something in his tone or expression must have struck her as odd, for she tilted her head slightly, studying him more intently. "You're different from the others," she observed. "Your speech, your manner. Where are you from exactly?" Before Archibald could formulate a response that wouldn't sound completely mad, his watch began its now familiar malfunction. The ticking grew louder, the face glowed, and the hands spun erratically. Simultaneously, the world around them slowed, colours bleeding out until everything took on a sepia tone like an old photograph. This time, however, the temporal anomaly didn't affect Charlotte. She remained animated, her eyes widening as she observed the phenomenon. "What on earth?" she breathed, looking around at the frozen soldiers in the trench, then back at Archibald. "What's happening?" "What is that device?" Archibald stared at her in astonishment. "You can see this? You're not affected like the others?" She shook her head slowly, wonder and confusion warring in her expression. "Everything stopped except us. And your watch, it's glowing." Before Archibald could respond, reality fractured again. This time, instead of freezing, the environment around them began to shift. images overlapping and merging like a photographic plate exposed multiple times. They saw the trench as it was, but also as it had been days or weeks earlier when freshly dug, and simultaneously as it would be years later, overgrown with grass and wildflowers, a scar slowly healing in the landscape. Charlotte grabbed Archibald's arm, her fingers digging in painfully. "Make it stop," she urged, her voice tight with fear. "Whatever you're doing, stop it." "I don't know how," he admitted, equally frightened. "It happens on its own. I think—" He broke off as a new vision intruded, the trench dissolving around them, replaced momentarily by a modern roadway with strange horseless carriages moving at impossible speeds, metal beasts that roared and belched smoke. Then that too vanished, replaced by the original trench, now frozen in time once more. The watch grew hot in Archibald's hand, not burning this time but pulsing with energy. Acting on instinct, he pressed it against the wound on his chest where its twin was branded into his flesh. There was a sensation like an electrical current passing through him, and the temporal distortion suddenly collapsed. The world snapped back to normal, soldiers continuing their tasks as if nothing had happened, unaware of the ripple in reality that had just washed over them. Charlotte stood very still, her face pale. "What are you?" she whispered. "I'm human, just like you," Archibald assured her quickly. "But I'm not from here. Not from now." She stared at him for a long moment, then, remarkably, a spark of curiosity replaced the fear in her eyes. "Come with me," she said decisively, taking his arm. "We need to talk, and not here." She led him through a series of turns in the trench, until they reached a small alcove that had been dug into the wall and curtained off with a piece of canvas. Inside was a crude desk fashioned from ammunition crates, stacked with medical supplies and paperwork. "My office, such as it is," Charlotte explained, gesturing for him to sit on one of the 2 wooden stools. "I sometimes use it when checking supplies or completing reports." She fixed him with a penetrating gaze. "Now tell me exactly who you are, and what just happened out there." Archibald hesitated. The rational part of his mind warned against revealing his impossible situation. She would think him mad, perhaps report him to the authorities as a spy or deserter suffering from delusions. Yet something in her direct gaze suggested a mind open to extraordinary possibilities, and he desperately needed an ally who understood this era far better than he did. Decision made, he began his tale, starting with his life in 1873, his father's mysterious disappearance, and the discovery of the device that had hurled him through time. He explained the temporal anomalies he'd been experiencing, the strange behaviour of his watch, and his desperate need to find a way home. Throughout his narrative, Charlotte listened without interruption, her expression shifting from scepticism to fascination. When he finally fell silent, she sat back, processing everything he had told her. "Under normal circumstances," she said after a long pause, "I would assume you were suffering from shell shock or some other psychological trauma, but I saw what happened in that trench. Time stopped, for everyone but us." She leaned forward, elbows on knees. "And there's something about you, your speech patterns, your confusion about things any soldier would know, little anachronisms in how you carry yourself. You're out of place here." "You believe me then?" Archibald asked, hardly daring to hope. "I'm not certain what I believe," she admitted, "but I know what I saw, and if there's even a chance you're telling the truth—" She trailed off, then smiled slightly. "Well, I've always had a weakness for impossible problems. Before the war, I was studying natural sciences at Bedford College. My professors thought I was wasting my education, that a woman should be content with a general understanding rather than pursuing serious scientific inquiry. I'd like to think they were wrong," hope sparked in Archibald's chest. "Then you'll help me?" "I'll try," she promised, "though I'm not sure how much help I can be with matters involving time travel. It's hardly covered in nursing textbooks." Her attempt at humour faded quickly. "But first I need to see that wound you mentioned. Where the watch burned you." Reluctantly, Archibald opened his shirt enough to reveal the circular burn on his chest. Charlotte's clinical detachment faltered momentarily at the sight. A perfect imprint of the watch face, the numerals and hands clearly visible on his reddened flesh like some bizarre tattoo. "Extraordinary," she murmured, leaning closer to examine it. "The skin isn't blistered as I would expect from a conventional burn. It's more like a brand, but impossibly detailed." She touched the edge of the mark gently, and Archibald gasped as another flicker of temporal distortion rippled through the dugout. Brief but unmistakable, the colours bleeding away for a split second before normalcy reasserted itself. Charlotte withdrew her hand quickly. "There's a connection," she said, her scientific mind clearly racing ahead, "between you, the watch, and these temporal events. Your physical body seems to be acting as some kind of conduit or anchor point." Before they could discuss further implications, a shell landed nearby, close enough to shake dirt from the dugout ceiling. The normal sounds of the front, which had faded into the background of their conversation, reasserted themselves with jarring clarity. "I have to go," Charlotte said, gathering her medical bag. "There will be casualties from that barrage, and I'm needed at the clearing station, but I want to continue this conversation." She scribbled something on a scrap of paper. "I'm off duty tomorrow evening. Meet me here, at this map reference. It's an abandoned farmhouse just behind our lines. The medical officers use it sometimes, but it should be empty then." Archibald took the paper, suddenly reluctant to see her leave. Charlotte represented his first real hope of understanding what was happening to him, and possibly finding a way home. "I'll be there," he promised. "And thank you for believing me, or at least not thinking me completely mad." She paused at the entrance to the dugout. "Oh, I haven't ruled out madness entirely, yours or mine. But madness would be a far less interesting explanation than time travel, don't you think?" With that parting comment and a brief smile, she was gone, leaving Archibald alone with his thoughts and the ever-present background symphony of war. Remembering his original assignment, he hastened to deliver the message to Captain Blackwood, finding the officer in a forward observation post peering through a periscope at the German lines. The captain barely acknowledged him, simply pocketing the envelope with a grunt of dismissal. Messenger duty, Archibald was learning, involved a great deal of hurrying, followed by being treated as if one were invisible. As he made his way back through the trench system, the day's activities swirled around him. Men cleaning weapons, repairing damaged sections of the trench wall, writing letters home, or simply staring into space with thousand-yard gazes that spoke of horrors witnessed and absorbed. It struck Archibald that despite being displaced in time, he was effectively trapped here, subject to the same dangers as these men whose war this actually was. That evening, as he sat with Cooper and the others in their dugout, attempting to choke down another meal of unidentifiable meat and hardtack, news filtered down from command. There would be a major push in 3 days' time, a renewed offensive to break the stalemate. The men received this information with grim resignation rather than enthusiasm or fear. Yet another march into the meat grinder, with success measured in yards gained and lives expended. "Will it make any difference?" Archibald asked Cooper quietly. "This offensive, will it change anything?" Cooper considered the question with more seriousness than Archibald had expected. "Probably not in the grand scheme," he admitted. "We take their trench, they counterattack and take it back. A few hundred dead on both sides, and the lines end up more or less where they started." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled chin. "But someday one side or the other will break. Has to happen eventually. Every empire falls in the end." Archibald was struck by the philosophical depth behind Cooper's seemingly simple statement. This ordinary carpenter from Bristol had been forced by circumstances to contemplate matters of history and human nature that most people never considered. War, for all its horror, seemed to strip away pretension and force a stark confrontation with reality. "And what will you do?" Archibald asked. "After the war, I mean. If you—" He stopped, unwilling to voice the obvious caveat. "If I survive?" Cooper finished for him with a grim smile. "Go home, rebuild my life, try to forget." He shrugged. "Same as everyone else. Or maybe that's just what I tell myself to get through each day. Truth is, I can't really imagine a world without this anymore." He gestured around the dugout. "Can't remember what it feels like to wake up without the sound of guns, to walk without crouching, to breathe air that doesn't taste of cordite and death." The conversation lapsed into silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. As darkness fell outside and the dugout was illuminated only by the dim light of a single lantern, Archibald examined his watch again. It seemed stable for now, ticking with the steadiness that had once made it a reliable companion rather than a mysterious harbinger of temporal chaos. Yet as he studied it, he noticed something he had missed before. Tiny symbols etched around the inner edge of the case, nearly invisible unless one knew to look for them. They resembled the runes on his father's device, though simpler in form. Had they always been there, or were they another manifestation of the watch's transformation? Archibald's contemplation was interrupted by a commotion at the dugout entrance. A runner appeared, breathless with urgency. "Engineers need men," he announced. "Tunnel collapse in Sector 7. Anyone not on watch, follow me." Several of the men groaned but rose to their feet, grabbing helmets and gloves. Cooper motioned for Archibald to join them. "Come on," he said. "Digging's better than sitting here waiting for a shell with your name on it." They followed the runner through the darkened trench system to an area Archibald hadn't seen before, where a large entrance had been cut into the trench wall, reinforced with timber supports. Men were emerging from this opening, covered in dirt and coughing violently. Others were organising rescue equipment, shovels, picks, lanterns and stretchers. Part of the countermining operation collapsed, an engineer sergeant explained as he assigned them positions. "We've got men trapped about 50 yards in. Need to shore up the affected section and get them out before Fritz realises what's happened and sends over some heavy stuff to finish the job." Archibald soon found himself in a line of men passing sandbags and timber supports into the tunnel entrance. The work was backbreaking, made worse by the oppressive heat and lack of air in the confined space. Those entering and exiting the tunnel looked increasingly exhausted, their faces streaked with sweat-tracked mud, eyes red from the dust. After perhaps an hour of this labour, a shout came from inside. "We're through! We need stretcher-bearers!" Cooper immediately volunteered, pulling Archibald with him. "Come on," he urged, "or it's our duty." Reluctantly, Archibald followed him into the tunnel, a cramped, timber-lined passage barely tall enough to stand in, lit at intervals by lanterns that cast more shadows than light. The air was thick with dust and the smell of disturbed earth, making each breath an effort. They hunched forward, moving deeper into the claustrophobic space until they reached a section where the tunnel widened slightly into a crude chamber. There, several men lay on the ground, some moving weakly, others ominously still. Engineers worked frantically to stabilise a section of ceiling that had partially collapsed, while medics attended to the injured. Cooper and Archibald were directed to a man with a clearly broken leg who needed evacuation. As they carefully lifted the injured soldier onto a stretcher, Archibald's watch began its now familiar malfunction. The ticking accelerated, echoing strangely in the confined space as if coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The face glowed, casting eerie shadows on the tunnel walls. "Not now," Archibald muttered, desperately willing the temporal disturbance to subside. The last thing he needed was to create some catastrophic anomaly deep underground, where any disruption could bring tons of earth down upon them all. But the phenomenon intensified. The air thickened, time slowed, and once again Archibald found himself in that strange between state, where he alone remained fully animated while others moved with glacial slowness. The light from the lantern stretched into long, fluid streamers that danced across the walls like living things. Then, with horrifying clarity, Archibald saw something no one else could. Fracture lines spreading through the timber supports above them, wooden beams beginning to splinter under the weight they held back. In the normal flow of time, these breaks were still forming, invisible to the naked eye. But in this dilated moment, Archibald could see the disaster unfolding before it happened. The supports would fail completely within minutes, burying everyone in the chamber. As he watched, frozen in horror, the temporal distortion shifted again. Now he saw not just the impending collapse, but multiple potential outcomes branching from this moment like paths in a garden, each determined by the actions taken or not taken in the next crucial minutes. In most of these potential futures, the tunnel collapsed with devastating loss of life, but in a few, specific interventions resulted in everyone escaping before catastrophe struck. The revelation hit Archibald with the force of epiphany. Perhaps this was why he had been sent here, to this specific place and time, not randomly, but with purpose. His father's device hadn't malfunctioned. It had worked exactly as designed, placing him at a temporal nexus point where his knowledge of future events could alter history's course. But should he interfere? The question plagued him even as time began to resume its normal flow. If he changed events here, what ripples might spread outward, affecting the timeline in ways he couldn't possibly predict? Yet if he did nothing, men would die who might otherwise live. The moral calculus seemed impossible, but the decision, he realised, had already been made for him. He couldn't stand by and watch men die when he had the power to save them. Whatever consequences might flow from his interference, they couldn't be worse than the burden of inaction. As reality solidified around him, Archibald raised his voice urgently. "Everyone out!" Now! The supports are failing! The engineers looked at him sceptically until one of them noticed a fresh crack appearing in a timber directly above them, accompanied by an ominous creaking sound. "He's right," the man shouted. "Evacuate! Move the wounded first!" A flurry of activity ensued as stretchers were hastily loaded and men began filing toward the exit. Archibald helped Cooper with their assigned casualty, moving as quickly as the confined space allowed. Behind them, the groaning of the overburdened supports grew louder, small showers of dirt beginning to rain down from the ceiling. They had nearly reached the tunnel entrance when a massive crash echoed from the chamber they had just left, followed by a concussive wave of dust and displaced air that knocked several men off their feet. The collapse had begun. "Run!" someone shouted unnecessarily, as everyone was already moving at their maximum speed through the restrictive tunnel. Archibald and Cooper staggered the last 20 yards to the entrance, emerging into the relative openness of the trench just as a rumbling series of secondary collapses shook the ground beneath their feet. As they set down their stretcher and looked back, dirt continued to fountain from the tunnel entrance, gradually diminishing as the collapse stabilized. Men were counting heads, checking who had made it out and who might still be trapped inside. "How did you know?" Cooper asked Archibald, his voice hushed with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "About the supports failing? You called it before anyone else saw the signs." Archibald opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure how to explain. Before he could formulate a response, the engineer sergeant approached, his face grey with dust but his eyes sharp with curiosity. "Good eye, lad," the sergeant said. "Don't know how you spotted that fracture from where you were standing, but you saved lives today. If we'd stayed in that chamber another minute—" He left the thought unfinished, clapping Archibald on the shoulder before moving off to organise the wounded men's evacuation to the field hospital. Cooper continued to study Archibald with newfound interest. "There's something different about you," he said finally. "Can't put my finger on it, but it's there." He smiled slightly. "Whatever it is, I'm glad you were with us tonight." As they made their way back to their dugout, Archibald felt the weight of what had just happened settling on his shoulders. He had changed events, potentially altered history's course. The men who had survived the tunnel collapse because of his warning would go on to affect other events, creating a cascade of changes that could theoretically spread outward indefinitely through time. Yet the timeline hadn't immediately unravelled, suggesting that perhaps history had more resilience than he feared, or perhaps the changes he had made were so minor in the grand scheme that they created only ripples, not waves, in the river of time. More important was the implication that his displacement might have purpose, that he had been sent to this particular moment for a reason. If that were true, what other interventions might he be meant to make, and who or what had orchestrated this journey? His father, some higher power, or merely the impersonal mechanism of the universe self-correcting some temporal anomaly? As these questions churned in his mind, Archibald became aware of a new development. The burn mark on his chest, the imprint of the watch face, had begun to change. The numerals and hands that had been branded into his flesh were shifting positions, just as they did on the actual timepiece during moments of temporal distortion. When he touched the mark, images flashed through his mind, fragmented visions of places he had never seen, events that had not yet occurred. Most vivid among these was a recurring image of a particular section of the battlefield, a seemingly unremarkable stretch of no man's land distinguishable only by a blasted tree stump and an unusual configuration of shell craters. In this vision, the earth itself seemed to shimmer and distort, as if reality were thinner there than elsewhere. With sudden certainty, Archibald knew this was what he needed to find. A weak point in the fabric of time, perhaps the very spot where his arrival had punched through the normal constraints of chronology. If there were any hope of returning to his own era, it would begin there. The next evening, after completing his messenger duties for the day, Archibald made his way to the abandoned farmhouse where Charlotte had arranged to meet him. The structure stood perhaps half a mile behind the front lines, damaged by shell fire but still largely intact, its stone walls having withstood what its wooden roof had not. Inside, the remaining furniture had been repurposed or scavenged, leaving only a few chairs and tables scattered among the debris. Charlotte was already waiting, having exchanged her nurse's uniform for a simple dress and coat that made her look startlingly civilian amidst the militarized zone. She had spread several maps and papers on a table and lit a small oil lamp that cast long shadows across the room's irregular surfaces. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said, without preamble as Archibald entered, "and I have a theory. It's rather fantastical, but no more so than time travel itself." "I'm listening," Archibald replied, taking a seat across from her. "What if the device your father created wasn't meant to send people through time randomly, but to specific moments when intervention was needed?" She leaned forward earnestly. "There are certain points in history that serve as nexus events, moments when small actions can have disproportionate effects on future outcomes. What if your father found a way to identify these moments and built a machine that could place someone there to ensure the right choice was made?" The theory aligned with Archibald's own recent thoughts regarding the tunnel collapse, but raised further questions. But why me? And why this particular war? What could be so important here that it would justify tearing someone from their own time? Charlotte's expression grew sombre. "This isn't just any war, Archibald. The scale of this conflict is unprecedented in human history. Millions are already dead, and millions more will die before it's over. And I fear it won't truly end even when the fighting stops. The hatred and resentment being sown now will bear bitter fruit for generations." She pushed one of her papers toward him, a series of calculations and diagrams he didn't fully understand. "I've been studying reports from all along the front, looking for patterns in what you described. Moments when time seems to behave abnormally. There are accounts, mostly dismissed as hallucinations or battle fatigue, of soldiers experiencing strange phenomena, moments that repeat, premonitions of events seconds before they occur, glimpses of landscapes as they existed before the war." "Temporal fractures," Archibald murmured, remembering the crack-like patterns he had seen in the air during his own experiences. "Exactly, and they seem to cluster in specific areas." She pointed to several locations marked on her map, particularly here, near what the soldiers call the Blasted Heath, a section of no man's land that's been contested so many times the earth itself seems changed by it. Archibald felt a shiver of recognition. A stretch with a distinctive tree stump and an unusual pattern of shell craters? Charlotte looked up sharply. "Yes. How did you know?" He explained about the visions he'd been experiencing, the changing mark on his chest, and his growing certainty that this location held the key to understanding his displacement. As he spoke, Charlotte's expression shifted from scientific curiosity to something approaching awe. "It's all connected," she breathed. "You, the watch, these fractures in time, they're part of something larger. The question is, what are you meant to do now that you're here?" Before Archibald could respond, the distant rumble of artillery grew suddenly louder, and the farmhouse shuddered as shells began landing closer than before. A new barrage, heavier than the usual evening. Hate. Charlotte quickly gathered her papers. "We should get to shelter. The Germans must have spotted movement in this sector and adjusted their fire." They hurried to the farmhouse cellar, a stone-walled chamber that offered better protection than the partially destroyed upper floors. As they descended the stairs, the building took a direct hit, the impact sending them tumbling the remaining distance to the cellar floor. Dust and debris rained down, as part of the ceiling collapsed, but the sturdy stone walls held. Archibald picked himself up, coughing in the dust-filled air. "Are you hurt?" he called to Charlotte, who was pushing herself to a sitting position nearby. "Just bruised, I think," she replied, brushing debris from her clothing. "But we may be trapped down here until someone digs us out." As if to confirm her assessment, there was another crash from above as more of the structure gave way, sending a cascade of timber and stone tumbling down the cellar stairs, their only exit. A few final pieces clattered down, and then silence fell, broken only by the muffled continuing barrage outside and the settling of debris around them. Archibald examined their prison by the light of Charlotte's lamp, which had miraculously survived the fall. The cellar was about 15 feet square, now partially filled with rubble from above. The walls appeared intact, but the staircase was completely blocked by debris that would take hours to clear, even with proper tools. "Someone will come looking eventually," Charlotte said, attempting to sound optimistic. "The medical officers know I sometimes use this place. When I don't return to the clearing station..." She trailed off, both of them aware of the reality. In the chaos of war, with casualties constantly demanding attention, it might be days before anyone noticed her absence, let alone organised a search party to this particular location. Archibald was about to offer some words of encouragement when his watch began its familiar malfunction. The ticking accelerated, The face glowed, and time around them began to distort. But this anomaly was different from previous occurrences, more intense, more focused. The air itself seemed to warp and bend, colours inverting momentarily before settling into a state where everything appeared slightly out of alignment, as if viewed through imperfectly ground lenses. "It's happening again," Charlotte whispered, moving closer to Archibald. "But something's different this time." She was right. Rather than freezing or slowing, time seemed to be folding around them, creating what Archibald could only describe as pockets of temporal distortion throughout the cellar. In one corner, rubble that had fallen during the collapse now rose back to the ceiling, then fell again in an endless loop. In another, dust motes hung completely motionless in the air, while everything else continued to move normally. Most dramatically, a section of the cellar wall directly opposite them began to shimmer and fade, revealing glimpses of other times and places. The farmhouse as it had been before the war, green fields stretching to distant trees, the same location decades in the future, overgrown but peaceful, and most disturbingly a vision of trenches more ancient than their own, filled with soldiers in Roman armour, suggesting this land had known war long before the current conflict. "It's as if the barriers between time streams are breaking down," Archibald said, watching in fascination and horror as reality fluctuated around them. "My presence here, my interference with events, I think I'm causing damage to the fabric of time itself." Charlotte's scientific mind was clearly racing to process what she was witnessing. Or perhaps these barriers were already weakened, and that's why your father's device sent you here specifically, to repair the damage, not cause it. As if responding to their discussion, the watch grew hot in Archibald's hand, while the matching brand on his chest burned with renewed intensity. Acting on instinct, he pressed the watch against the mark, gasping as energy surged through him like an electrical current. The cellar around them destabilized further, reality seeming to hold its form only directly around their bodies, while dissolving into temporal chaos elsewhere. Through this maelstrom a pattern emerged. Various visions and distortions began to organize themselves into what appeared to be a pathway, leading to the shimmering section of wall that now resembled a doorway more than a solid barrier. "I think," Archibald said slowly, "we're being shown a way out. Not just from this cellar, but perhaps a way for me to return home." Charlotte gripped his arm tightly. "If you step through that portal, or whatever it is, you might end up anywhere, any time. It could be a one-way journey with no guarantee of reaching your own era." "I know," he acknowledged, "but I'm beginning to understand why I was sent here. Not just to save those men in the tunnel, but to witness this war, to understand what humanity is capable of both in cruelty and courage. Perhaps my father hoped that knowledge from the future might somehow help change the past.